Welcome to the Wagon Quilt Company. This is block 5 of Around the Corner, a quilt designed by Wendy Williams. And it's been really fun to do the blocks and hope you've enjoyed doing the blocks. If you haven't done them, make sure you access our YouTube tutorials. We have one for each of the blocks. And you can look them up on YouTube or if you haven't gotten the link, but I try to send you a link for each of them each month so you have them available to you. In the pattern, Around the Corner pattern, this block is actually block number 3, but I gave it to you as number 5 because it seemed more in order. You do this one around the trees and the grass pieces that you've done previously. I also found that this was probably the most difficult block for me to do, not because it was hard to put together, but because the measurements didn't quite match up. So what I have done is actually redesign the pattern for you. And I have one of these for each of you. If you're not here for the class, I'm happy to send one to you, or you can come into the shop and I can give you one. I'll put one in each of your files so you have the revised instructions. You're welcome to use the ones that Wendy Williams has used in her pattern, but I did find them a little bit difficult, and I think this might be a little bit easier for you to work with. The instructions for putting together the blocks actually weren't a problem. It was just that it didn't quite fit. And so I sat down with my husband, who's better at math than I was. It's been a couple of years since I did my geometry class in high school, so he had to remind me of some of the formulas. When you put together or you cut a 2-inch block and then put it on the bias, basically, then there's not an even number. And so I'm going to give you some ideas of how to make this fit just a little bit better.
Oh, so what you mean, Marianne, when you turn it
Yes.
on point?
When you turn it on point, which would be a way a quilter would say it,
Yes.
then a 2-inch square isn't an even number.
All right.
And so for it to fit the 54-inch that we need for the center part of the quilt, then it's just a little bit tricky to get it to fit correctly. Right. So I'm going to give you some ideas of how that might work. This block includes what we call Seminole patchwork. And the Seminole Indians or Native Americans are a group of Native Americans, and I guess that's where they got the name because a lot of the things that are done kind of have this Native American look. And that's quite a popular look right now with modern quilts also. So I think a lot of things are coming back. This is a book that I had from the early 80s. And they did things like vests and skirts and such. But it's kind of fun because she has different ways that she's put together. You can see the Seminole patchwork here. And some of the patterns that she has in this book for Seminole patchwork.
That's cool.
So it's the same idea. So what we're going to do as we start this block is you have 4 bright colors in your kit. We have an orange, a purple, a yellow, and a pink or kind of a red. And those are the bright colors. They'll be stripped like this. So you'll cut your center piece or your bright color at 2.5 inches. And then you'll cut these into strips, this kind of circle fabric right here. And it's kind of wild, but it turns out really fun when you get it into the block. So this one you'll cut in strips of 2 3/4 inches. And in the new instructions that I have for you, it tells you that. So you'll cut 12 2 3/4 inch strips of this, and you'll cut the bright ones into 2 2.5 inch strips. And when you strip piece them together, you'll have a unit that looks like this right here. This is the full width of the fabric. And then you'll also need another half of a strip to complete all of the squares that you need.
Okay.
So I just cut these in half, and I had one of these left over, but use 1/2 here and 1/2 here. So you need 1.5 of these units. So you'll just do that a regular way. You're going to strip piece them. What I would suggest is to make the measurements fit, that you take just a scant 1/4 inch seam when you're piecing this together. And it does say that on the instructions. Just a tiny bit, you know, just a scant. So you'll end up with pieces like this.
So does each color have 1.5 strips?
Yes, each color will have 1.5 strips.
Okay.
Thanks for making that clear. Then I'm just going to square up this strip here. And I'm going to cut 2.5 inch strips, but because the measurements and the math in it are a little bit difficult, I'll say. It doesn't come out on even numbers when you put things on point. So when I cut these strips right here, I'm gonna cut them just a tad bit bigger than 2.5 inches. And that doesn't mean 2 1/8, I would say 2 1/16 would be about right. So I'm just gonna cut these, subcut these just a tiny bit larger than the
So
2.5 inches.
Yeah, so if they're 2.5, you need to add a little 16th or something.
Yeah, about that. The problem with this is it's really hard to be perfectly accurate, but we're trying to do our best here. And that was a problem with the original pattern, is that it just didn't end up fitting correctly. So we're gonna subcut these at 2.5, just a tiny bit. And you will need 19 of these units to make each of the borders. So you'll have plenty with those, that 1.5 strips to subcut these at 2.5 plus just a tiny bit. So when that's done, what you're going to do is sew these pieces back together. So what you're going to do is take, and this yellow one doesn't show up quite as well, but where you're going to pin them is so the colored piece will be offset in each row. So we're going to pin these together right on the seam allowance, but it's going to be offset like this, if you can see it in the video. So when you piece all of them together, what you'll get is a border that looks like this.
Wow.
So this is kind of ragged edges, but this is how we're going to get our Seminole patchwork. See how it kind of has that Native American feel in a certain way. So you're going to also sew these. I did just a scant 1/4 inch on this, or made sure that I was really intentional when I did my cutting and also did my seaming to make sure that they were pretty accurate. You
So
can
those
do
seams are just butted right up against each other, right?
Yeah, and so
Okay.
they're offset. So it's almost like you're going down each time. And I sewed all the way to the end just so I could, what do you call it? I could continually keep sewing, but you don't have to do that. You can stop and start again. You can see how my stitch goes all the way off, and then I would start the next one.
Yeah.
This will have 19 of the bright colored squares in this border. And at the very end, right here, to make it square, I'm going to need to add a little piece of the background fabric. So I suggested you cut this 2.5 by 3 inches. And then you're going to add this piece to the end right here so you can make it square when you finish it. And it does have some pretty good instructions or visuals in the pattern that show you how to do that. So the end will look like this. And you can see how I can trim off these jagged edges and make it straight. So the next thing I'm going to do is take this that I've sewn all together. And it's kind of fun to put these together. It doesn't take too much time. In the end, you want your border to look like this. So you can see I'm going to have to cut off those jagged edges. So I'm going to take this piece right here, and the different thing that I did when I rewrote the pattern was I actually made these squares just a little bit bigger. The border needs to be 3 inches finished, and what Wendy Williams had done in the pattern is made them just a little bit smaller, and then she had added a tiny strip of fabric on the end here, or on the edge, to make it the 3 inches. And it looked okay, but it sort of bugged me just a little, and I'm not really a perfectionist.
Oh, okay.
So it might bug other people even more.
So you got rid of that little...
I did get rid of completely the little strip that she added here to make it 3 inches finished. So these blocks are just a little bit bigger than in the pattern that Wendy Williams did. You will also have just a little bit extra here on each side. So you're not going to trim it down to 1/4 of an inch past each junction as you normally would. You're going to have just a little bit more space on each edge. Okay, and that's going to make your 3-inch border finished. So you're going to cut these down to a 3.5-inch strip, and then when it's finished it will be 3 inches, if that's understandable. Yes. With your seam allowances. Yeah. So what I'll do is I'll put this down, and with my ruler, if you had a 3.5-inch ruler, it would probably be even easier, because then you wouldn't get off. But what I want to do is center those diamonds in that 3.5-inch space. And this is just a little tricky. You don't want to cut it wrong. So if you have a choice, it would probably be really nice if you could get a 3.5-inch ruler to do this.
Do you guys sell them?
I think they have them, yeah. I can do it this way, but you hate to cut it wrong, because then you'd have to do the whole thing over again. So I'm going to trim it with those diamonds being right in the middle of the 3.5 inches. I'm going to have to turn it because I don't have a 3.5-inch ruler. So I'm going to trim off all these little jagged edges right here. And it will look like this when you finish. I also want to trim off these jagged edges on the end right here. And you can do that right now. I might trim it and leave it a little bit larger. And then measure it. What you'll find is when you do so many seams that a little tiny bit, a 32nd of an inch, when you do it 20 times, can add up to a lot of difference in your length of your piece. So putting this border on, you want it to fit the space, and that was the problem before. With the other pattern, I couldn't get it to fit my space. You want this piece, and let me just make sure I've got it right. You want this to be 57.5 inches when it's complete. So I'm going to measure it. doubled over, so I could put it on the long one and see how I'm doing.
Yeah.
And what I found doing it is that each border was just a little bit different than the other. I'm gonna come close to the camera.
Oh.
Mine's pretty close, but I also left just a little bit extra on the
Extra.
end of that.
Yeah. So on the top of the diagram,
Mhm.
you've got it 54 and a half. And
Correct.
on the bottom, you've got 57 and a half. What is the difference?
If you look at the pattern on the front of your pattern, you will see that the color of the borders, and I was trying to use my dry erase board, but it doesn't work.
Okay.
But the border only comes to the end with one piece, one
Left.
square left.
Okay.
So this will go in the corner.
Okay, I've gotcha.
And so you want this whole thing to measure 57 and a half, but if you only measure from this end to right here,
Mm-hmm.
without including, you'd have to include the seam,
Mhm.
then that needs to be 54 and a half inches.
Okay. All right. Great.
So if you look at your pattern, and maybe I can borrow yours, or let me grab mine. You'll see in the pattern on that border that the yellow starts here in the corner and goes all the way to here.
Oh.
Then the orange one starts in the corner and goes all the way to here. And that's why this is the 54 and a half inch measurement,
Okay.
but you need 57 and a half if you've added that other square right there on the corner.
Got it.
What I actually have done a couple of times, and maybe this is my secret, but if it's a 1/4 of an inch a little too short, I've sometimes just pulled on it just a little bit as I ironed, so it just stretches to make that measurement. Another thing I have done to make it so it fits, because you don't want it to be wavy, is I have been known to go back and take a little bit extra seam allowance in a couple of these to make it a little bit shorter if it's too long, so it will fit that space. One thing that will make your quilt look really nice and lay flat is if you get the measurements correct. And so you want this to measure correctly. You don't want to really fudge it a whole bunch. I think you could probably fudge it a 1/4 of an inch or a little bit more perhaps. But more than that, you're either gonna get it pulling if it's too tight, or you're gonna have it go wavy if it's too long. So you really wanna work at getting these borders the correct length to fit. So it's not a hard block to do, it's just a really fun one. The hard part is just getting it to fit correctly. So work on making sure you're doing your correct seam allowance and you're measuring to make sure it's gonna fit when you put it on. So have fun doing this block. This is just a really easy one, and hopefully you can do it and catch up on your other blocks maybe that you're a little behind on.
Thanks, Marianne.
Do you have any questions, Kathleen?
I don't think so. I think I'm okay.
Okay. Well, thanks for joining us, and join us next time for our tutorial on the around the corner. See you again. Stay well.